that has swept the world, nowhere has experienced more widespread turmoil than the South American subcontinent. The military coup in 1964 in Brazil set in motion a wave of counter-revolutions which spread across the globe as far as Indonesia. But the countries of Latin America especially have largely tended to move in step. The Brazilian coup set in motion a chain reaction in which Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and many more fell under the general's jackboot. And then came the collapse of these brutal regimes in the 1990s and the election of left reformist governments, and then once again their subsequent fall. And now it seems once again, more than ever, the entire region is united in a new upsurge of mass protest from Colombia to Chile, from Peru to Brazil. And now Colombia had become a byword for drug production, guerrilla war, and brutal military repression. But over the last year, it's been the scene of one of the biggest popular mobilizations, even by Latin American standards, with huge demonstrations and general strikes, including 1 million marching in Bogota and more throughout the country. So we're discussing today what are the prospects for their struggle. And we're very happy to welcome Ted Zuur, a seasoned veteran of the workers' movement in San Francisco, who now lives in Colombia and can offer us a unique perspective on these events. So Ted, over to you.
Okay, well, you already gave my presentation. I don't have to say anything.
Perhaps you can add a little.
Thank you for inviting me here. And also thank you for spelling Colombia correctly, because almost everybody in the United States misspells it. They think it's the same as the university in New York. I think Roger's invitation was a little bit overly enthusiastic. Latin America is not currently being rocked by mass protests, and least of all Colombia. However, it has been recently. And what has happened is those movements have gone indoors and they have gone into the voting booth. And this is why you have what people call the second pink tide. Because the protest movement has moved into an electoral phase. I would say that second pink tide includes the election of the PDR, the PDR in Mexico, with Lopez Obrador. And the problems of the pink tide show up in his government, which is a disaster in many ways, especially for the left, but I'm not going to talk about Mexico. It includes the election of Borge in Chile, but especially the Constitutional Convention, which is producing a new constitution right now in Chile. It includes the election of Xiomara Castro in Honduras, the election of Pedro Castillo in Peru, and interestingly, the return of the Movimiento al Socialismo in Bolivia and the election of Luis Arce, after there was a coup that removed Morales, and the coup failed, essentially. I'm not going to go into those other countries, and each country is a separate process. There are lots and lots of differences in Latin America. You know, in Brazil, people speak Portuguese. In the rest of Latin America, people speak Spanish. But the differences among the countries are huge. And the idea that, I'm sure that you people are fairly knowledgeable people, so I'm not going to give you a class in Latin American history, culture, political economy, but the differences are huge. You can't equate what's going on in one country with another country. Do any of you know who Maluma is? No, nobody knows Maluma. How about Shakira? You ever hear of Shakira? No. How about James Rodriguez? You might know him as James Rodriguez. Okay, not too much. Do you ever hear of Ivan Duque? No. Oh, good. One person knows Ivan Duque. Ivan Duque is the president of Colombia currently. How about Francia Marquez? Anybody know who Francia Marquez is? Cheryl knows. I know Cheryl knows. Okay, so Shakira has won a lot of Grammy Awards. She's a pop singer. She's sort of like the competition to Madonna, only she's getting old now. James Rodriguez is a football player who played for Manchester United, among others. And I won't go through who the other people are, but Francia Marquez is an important political figure. Francia Marquez is the vice presidential candidate of the Pacto Historico, which is the left-wing electoral alliance in this election. Francia Marquez is a Black woman from the Pacific Coast of Colombia, was a leader of protest movements to defend the historically Black communities of the coast and to stop the environmental destruction of the mining and lumber companies. Very interesting candidate. She also won the Goldman Award, which you may not know about. The Goldman Award is given by a foundation in San Francisco, and people call it the Environmental Nobel Prize. And that opened a lot of doors for Francia Marquez. Okay, we are in the middle of an election cycle here. In Colombia, we have a complicated election system here. First, you have a congressional and senatorial election, and that was on March 13th. On the same date, they had what in the United States we would call the primary elections, the internal party elections where they choose candidates. There were 3 primaries on that date. Then there will be a first round runoff election for president on May 29th. A first round election, I'm sorry, not a runoff. And if one candidate does not get 50% in that vote, there will be a runoff of the 2 highest vote getters on June 19th. So this is the election calendar, sort of. This country historically is not just a country, it's famous for cocaine. It's also maybe famous for coffee. It does produce great coffee. And it's a country that, I guess if you don't know who Maluma and Shakira are, you maybe don't know too much about the country. This country is maybe 5 times the land area of the United Kingdom. It's located near the equator, but it has 3 ranges of very high mountains of the Andes that run through it. And most of the people in the country live in those mountains and the valleys in between. So where I live in the city of Bogota, the metropolitan area has about 10 million people. The city proper has 7 to 8 million people. That's about 20% of the population of the country. The country's population is currently 50 million people. It is growing quite fast, unlike most countries on the planet. People often call this place a third world country. And that's a term I don't usually use, but it's an interesting country because this is a great example of combined and uneven development. You have much better fiber optic cable networks here than you do in the United States. And people generally have great internet service and good cell phone service everywhere, except for in the farthest reaches of the countryside. But if I go to some Andean valley, I can talk to you on my cell phone, no problem. Out in the Amazon, that's not true. But in most of the populated areas of the country, that is true. The country is next door to Venezuela and currently produces just about as much oil as Venezuela. And this is because Venezuelan oil production has dropped, which is great for the environment, but bad for Maduro and the people running that country. And Colombian oil production has slowly increased over the years. But Colombia is not addicted to oil in the sense that Venezuela always has been. Colombia has a very diverse biggest population in Latin America, bar Brazil and Mexico. Well, I think Argentina's population is bigger also, Ian. But I don't see you on the screen here, Ian. In any case, the economy of this country is very diverse. Officially, 65% of the people work in services, which is sort of bullshit. The country's agriculture includes not only cocaine and coffee, it also includes a lot of cattle. And one of the biggest exports, I would say the third biggest export after cocaine and coffee, is cut flowers. So if you go down and buy some flowers, a bouquet for a funeral or a friend, they're likely to be from Colombia or Ecuador. About 20% of the country's workforce is in manufacturing of one sort or another. Mining is important in this country, and mining is extraordinarily environmentally destructive in this country. A lot of strip mining. The Cerrejón open pit mine, coal mine in the north of the country, for a long time was the largest open pit mine in the world. The population of Colombia is what you might call mestizo. You know, when the Spanish invaded, they weren't as cruel as the British. They didn't kill everybody. Instead, they raped the women and married them. So you have a mestizo, a mixed population. But you also have a lot of Afro-Colombians because this country suffered from slavery just like the British colonies did. So you have a large Black population, a large indigenous population which survived the Spanish invasion, a very large mestizo population, and a very small population of white people who will not marry somebody who is not white. And that tiny little 1% generally are very wealthy. So this country's brand of racism is virulent, horrible, but a lot different and less obvious than racism in a place like the United Kingdom or the United States. This country has a political history of civil wars between two bourgeois parties, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. And those civil wars continued right until the 1950s, which was called La Violencia. After the assassination of the leader of the left wing of the Liberal Party, a guy named Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, a period of civil war opened up, but not official civil war. A liberal dictator took over, a guy named Rojas Pinilla, with the intention of repressing the right and the left. And he mostly succeeded in repressing the left. In that period of history, which you can go from maybe the 50s up until, Rojas Pinilla's didn't last very long. There was a coup d'etat that kicked him out. And it put into power the Liberal and Conservative Party together. They formed the National Front government. which survived until the 1990s. Rojas Pinilla ran an election campaign against it and won, and the election was stolen. Part of his party formed a guerrilla movement called M19, M19, the April 19th movement. And, okay, I'm going ahead of myself here. I have to say, during La Violencia, the Communist Party, which was small but had some mass influence in some areas of the peasantry and of the country's workers, because the Communist Party during the third period organized the unions of this country more than anybody else did. They organized an armed defense movement, which became the FARC, the Frentes Armados Revolucionarios Colombianos. So the FARC was defending people in the countryside against the military. And the FARC needed money, the FARC needed weapons. And there's a simple way to get money. You go to the house of a rich guy and say, give me your fucking money, asshole, or I'll kill you. So the FARC grew through extortion. And it became a strong armed force, 20,000 people under arms by 2000. And it was continuously in conflict with the government. The second armed force, the M19, was formed from people who split from the Rojas Pinilla movement and people who split from the FARC. One faction of the FARC said, we need to be in the cities. The working class is in the cities. This country now is 85% urban, but at that time it was 70% urban. The masses of the oppressed were not in the countryside, they were in the city. So a guy named Jaime Bataman, who you don't need to remember, led a split from the FARC. They joined together with these guys from Rojas Pinilla's movement, and they formed M19, M19. M19 did a lot of spectacular things, like capturing the whole armory of a military base by digging a tunnel, like stealing the sword of Simon Bolivar. And they became famous. And then they made a peace deal with the government in 1990. That peace deal was very important because it included a constitutional convention to rewrite the country's constitution. So in 1991, Colombia got a new constitution, which got rid of the old constitution modeled on the undemocratic model of the United States. And the new constitution defined the country as a social state under the rule of law. It's about 400 pages long. And it includes all kinds of things you would characterize as reactionary, neoliberal, all kinds of things that are social democratic. Like we have the right to healthcare in Colombia. This is a right like freedom of speech. All kinds of social democratic reforms on paper are in that constitution. So the legal left in Colombia descends from that constitution and defends it and fights for it. The right in Colombia is trying to get rid of that constitution. I'm not going to go through the history of the guerrilla wars until the peace agreement with the FARC, but in 2016, there was a peace agreement with the FARC. But that peace agreement was a lot different than the one with M19. And the FARC, when M19 demobilized, it gained a lot of popular support. The FARC didn't have popular support and does not have popular support. The FARC strategy, when it was under arms, leading up to peace negotiations, was to fight Colombian society, not just the Colombian state, which meant they blew up electricity lines. They blew up oil pipelines. And they extorted money from, not just from the very rich, but from small businesses in areas they controlled. And I'm not going to say a lot about the class structure of Colombia, but I will say this much. When you talk about the working class of Colombia, you know, the idea of a separate class of wage workers who go to work, get their paycheck, they have nothing but their labor to sell, it mostly doesn't exist. What you have is a class of people who are mixed together. They have a little house that they built themselves. And in the garage, they run a store. And the wife goes to work as a maid, except then the husband gets a job doing construction and she takes care of the store. This kind of mixture of the poor petty bourgeoisie and the working class dominates what you would call the working class. And it dominates the kind of movements you have in this country. Only 2% of the population is under union contract. The largest, most important union is FECODE. FECODE is the teachers' union. It's very powerful, and it is the political heart of every left-wing political alliance as well. The industrial workers are mostly unorganized. The mine workers are mostly unorganized. The oil workers in the state-owned oil company, Ecopetrol, are organized in an important and strong union, but it has only 10,000 people. Most of the oil industry is unorganized. The transportation industry is organized, but by small owners. And the small owners are of trucks are in a business association with the big trucking companies who dominate. Sort of like small independent truck drivers in the United States, I imagine in the UK too. So the level of organization on that level of the working class in Colombia is minuscule. So last year's general strikes were not general strikes in the sense that you might think in Europe, where you have a union confederation that calls a general strike and all the workers go out marching with their red flags. This is not like that. The Union Confederation did call this general strike, but the strike was really a movement of movements. So the Truckers Association participated in the strike for a while, and then they went home. The Potato Growers Association, which includes a lot of very rich people, but also some very poor small farmers, participated in the mobilization. But the heart of the mobilization was the working class youth. And the working class youth, a lot of them don't have jobs. They're not working, but they're working class. And what they did was they set up roadblocks all over the country, and they stopped everything in the country. The working class youth were the heart of that movement. And at the end of the movement got some concessions on paper, and everybody went home. They went home to get ready for this year's elections. On March 13th, the Pacto Historico, which includes a lot of fragments of the old left. Okay, I know I'm going too long here, but let me just say one thing. One of the results of the Constitution of 1991 was the two-party system in Colombia of the Conservative and Liberal Party blew up, it dissolved. So now you have a very multi-party system. You have the Liberal Party gave birth to Cambio Radical, the Partido de la U, and the Conservative Party and part of the Liberal Party moved together to form an extreme right-wing movement called the Centro Democrático, which is led by a guy named Álvaro Uribe. And that movement has dominated the government of the country for nearly 2 decades now. The Uribistas were put into power by the United States behind the scenes. The US Embassy played a very big role in the formation of that movement and all of the backroom politics there. But it's very closely related to the drug dealers and to the paramilitary organizations. In fact, its main candidate now, a guy named Federico Gutierrez, had a key paramilitary as his right-hand man in the city government of the city of Medellin. The guy named Gustavo Villegas, which I won't go into that detail, but what's interesting is the centrist candidate of the center coalition also had Gustavo Villegas in his city government in Medellin. In other words, the 2 current coalitions of bourgeois parties, the right and the center, are both closely related to the paramilitaries of Colombia. So the only alternative here that's not related to the paramilitaries is the Pacto Historico. The Pacto Historico includes remnants of M19, remnants of the Polo Democrático Alternativo, which I didn't explain to you, but this is the left alternative that united all the legal left that was outside of the guerrilla movements, that included the Communist Party, the Maoists, some Trotskyists. The Polo Democrático became a pretty big party, and then it blew up. You also have the Green Party here, which is not really an environmentalist party, but it includes a lot of remnants of M19 and of the Polo Democrático too. So the Greens and the Pacto Historico are sort of on the left. These are not working class parties. These are cross-class alliances. To, sort of like what you might imagine the popular fronts were in Spain and France in the 1930s, but I wouldn't really compare them to that. The base of the vote of the Pacto Historico are the young voters who made the general strike last year. And on March 13th, the Pacto Historico elected 19 senators out of 100 to make them the largest bloc in the Senate. They elected 25 members of Congress, despite already demonstrated vote fraud against them. They have become the biggest party in the country, but they are far from a majority in the Senate of 102 members. They're far from a majority in the Chamber of Deputies. If they want to pass any laws, they have to make deals. So Gustavo Petro, their leader, who was he was the mayor of Bogota and generally considered a failure as mayor, although that catapulted him into the national stage where he now might be elected president, has been moving to the right to make deals with the Green Party, the Liberal Party, and a party called Cambio Radical. But the voters of the Pacto Historico are moving to the left. And Petro was unable to make a deal to get a more right-wing candidate for vice president. Instead, he had to choose his opponent in his own primary, Francia Marquez. So this is the most left-wing you could possibly get in elections in Colombia. The polls show that Petro and Francia Marquez might win on the first round. The rest of the political parties are running a campaign that says anyone but Petro. And the anyone but Petro is essentially vote for the status quo, which in the status quo means government by Uribismo, with the paramilitaries right behind the curtain and no change. I'm going to stop talking. I haven't included so many things here, like the pandemic, like the disaster in Venezuela and the millions of immigrants that are in this country. It's an extraordinarily complex political situation here. But the Pacto Historico may very well win with Petro as a president and a minority position in the Senate and the chamber, and a mass movement waiting to come out on the streets again. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Ted. It's open for questions, discussion. Who wants to go in first? Matthew.
Okay, comrades, in the absence of anyone else, in my sort of slender knowledge of history of Colombia, the one thing that really impressed me, I think, certainly last year, obviously, was this major, near uprising, led by, as you said, the youth. Which basically the confrontation, with armed cops, all sorts of people got killed over a whole period of weeks, and as you say, near on shut down very large chunks of the country, roadblocks and so on and so forth. Some very impressive interviews. Can you say any more about that? And because obviously, as far as I saw, it went outside of all these sort of. The driving force being youth, it went outside all the sort of traditional organizations, went outside the union leaderships, the whole thing, and they were left sort of following on. I saw one comment saying, well, this is almost sort of like watching an anarchist's dream, because it was driven entirely from the street. And you saying, well, we have no alternative, we must revolt. What else can we do? We've been screwed into the floor. So yeah, if you could say more about that would be really useful. Thanks.
Okay, well, Colombia has a long history of mass protest movements based in students at the public universities, especially the National University and the teachers' universities. And in the years just prior to the pandemic, that movement was growing. There was a national student strike that was very powerful, that got support from a lot of other people. And the government made serious concessions to the student movement. And then it reneged on all of its promises, or most of its promises. So those promises included things like free tuition or scholarships, a construction program at the National University. And I don't need to go into the details, but then the pandemic hit, the government reneged on its promises. The country, how can I put this? The central government's response to the pandemic was confused, and they ended up following the response of the Green Party administration of the city of Bogota, which was very radical restrictions on movement, trying to follow the Chinese model. And it worked pretty well in Bogota to control the pandemic, but nowhere else. However, the recession here was sharp, especially in retail trade and areas affected by the restrictions. All the discotheques were shut down, the parties were shut down, people were arrested for having parties in their homes. And the youth were very unhappy. So at the beginning of last year, the government said, okay, we're going to solve the country's financial problems because we're going into debt to the international banks because of our poor balance of trade, et cetera, due to the pandemic. So we're going to raise taxes, we're going to impose austerity measures. And the union said no. And the unions called a national general strike for one day. And the youth of the country said, yeah, let's go, but not for one day. And they stayed out with their road blockades. So the youth are very anarchist. They're not part of socialist organizations mostly. They're not part of the Maoist youth organizations. I don't feel like explaining the histories of these organizations or the Communist Party youth organization. They are mostly led by anarchists. And the anarchists, some of them like to have confrontations with the police. Most of them don't. But the anarchists who like confrontations are infiltrated by the police. So it's a very, very complex situation. So when the teachers union has a demonstration, the encapuchados, those are the people who wear hoods and masks, are kicked out. You can't be in the demonstration because those are the cops. Those are the people who are going to attack the ATM machine. Those are the people who are going to start a fight so that the mothers with the strollers and the babies will be injured. And so the whole mass movement will be discredited. But the violence that you're talking about, some of it was initiated by police provocateurs in the demonstration. Some of it was initiated by anarchists who really think that's a good thing to do. And a lot of it was just the police attacking demonstrations, just without provocation. The indigenous movement, which participated in the national strikes, was particularly singled out by the police. And the indigenous movement has its own militia, no guns, just machetes and clubs. And they killed at least 2 cops. So that movement was not essentially a violent movement. Violence was from the police, either provocateurs or police outside, and one part of the anarchists. And that part of that sector of the anarchists has an intersection with people who left the FARC and street gangs that sell drugs. That's a very complicated topic, which I'm not going to go into more than that. But that movement mobilized millions of people, millions, mostly nonviolently. They occupied the stations of the mass transit system with thousands of people. They changed the names, they changed the signs. Instead of Portal de las Americas, it was Portal de la Resistencia. It was something like a pre-revolutionary situation. But it wasn't that. It wasn't that because the regime was not in that kind of crisis.
Okay. Thanks. We've got Ed, then Ian, then Carol.
Well, thank you, Ted. Your introduction is full of really interesting facts, and my contribution is no more than questions, because I'm struggling to sort of piece together the bits of the jigsaw that you presumably because of curtailment of your time you presented to us. 70% of the workforce are in manufacturing. This is
20%, Ed. 70% urban,
okay.
population in 1970.
So,
80% urban population today.
20% of the workforce are in
20%
manufacturing, and
manufacturing.
70% is the urban population, right? Okay, right. There's a lot of mining, and it's very destructive of the environment. Okay. If there's a lot of mining, I find it really difficult to bring that together with the idea of wage workers mostly does not exist. The unions said no to austerity, and it led to a one-day national strike. And yet workers are mostly unorganized. I'm finding it very difficult to put these bits of information together. I haven't got a picture from, I mean, lots of very interesting, tantalizing facts, and also exciting, because there's obviously, you're talking about, there was something a bit like a pre-revolutionary situation. So lots of sort of exciting developments, but I can't put it all together into a sort of a sense of what is going on from the point of view of class struggle.
Well, that makes two of us.
Ted, can we take a few questions and then you come back? Is that all right?
Sure.
Yep. You finished, Ed? Ian.
Yes, I have, yeah.
Hi. Just like to maybe ask a couple of questions about the things you said yourself that you had a lot to say about but had to leave out. The situation in Venezuela, how that impacts Colombia. Is it seen as any kind of example? Presumably it was, at least in the Chavez days. How does Petro and Francia relate to the situation in Venezuela? And that, I suppose, links into the wider idea of the red tide that's ebbed and flowed in the last 20 years across Latin America, whereas Colombia has remained remarkably static on the right. Throughout that, the first left surge, then the right coming back. They didn't have to come back in Colombia to the same extent. And now, finally, it might be part of the second left advance. And what has caused it to be a bit of an outlier in the last period? Is it the legacy of the FARC conflict? Of course, it's not the only guerrilla conflict in South America, but it has been the most incredibly long and protracted and violent conflict, as well as bringing in all the drug gangs and the securitization of politics and the fascist paramilitaries that were set up. And it seems like the FARC had no real end point. It became this kind of protracted insurgency, a bit like the kind of endless one in the Philippines with the Maoists, or the Shining Path in Peru also made the situation move to the right there until recently. Or is there some other reason? Like, as I said in the chat, I was surprised to see when you were talking about some of the statistics, I chipped in with my own, because I was surprised to see recently in an article, Colombia's the third biggest country in Latin America. And like you, I thought Argentina would have been ahead of it. But on Wiki, it does seem to have the biggest population outside of Mexico and Brazil. Whereas on the map, it looks almost like one country chopped in two, with Venezuela, and also with some of the cultural stuff we get here. It seems to be a very similar cultural sphere to Venezuela. So why it's gone so much in a different direction, I don't know if some of that population difference reflects that, if it was easier in what's actually a smaller country by population for a left to advance, or if there's something deeper and more complex. But yeah, also with all these armed right-wingers, what would be the prospects for, as you say, the most left government that could possibly get elected is now, I don't know if it's odds on or 50-50, but with a real chance of getting elected. What would happen the day after they do with the right-wing paramilitaries?
Sorry, next is Carol, and then Cheryl.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very complicated and complex situation, but I feel a little like Ed, that I'm not sure that I get an overall sense of what's happening with the working class. Why, I mean, the miners traditionally are a pretty militant group and generally are organized in unions. And, you know, I don't know the history or not, but when Duque is the president, and he's run over the last couple of years an incredibly bloody regime, especially in the indigenous and Black communities. I mean, he would just send his paramilitaries into, you know, homes of students who were demonstrating in the streets and disappear them. And I'm just wondering a couple of things. One, what did the teachers union say or do about these disappearances of all of these students and these murders? Because even if the working class is, as I was in Colombia in the 70s, so I understand the sort of the mixture of the petty bourgeoisie and you know, women working in the stores and the husbands doing something else. And but the problem is, in my opinion, there doesn't seem to be an organization, a leftist revolutionary organization that could figure that out, because that happens in many countries. Colombia isn't unique. Certainly the Russian Revolution had 95%, you know, peasantry. There doesn't, and my next question is, I understand that the people that are running, Francia is very radical, and she's got this Nobel Prize or some prize for the environment and defends the Black community. But what's their position on the IMF? Because in fact, if they have to pay back those loans, which I'm sure the IMF is going to insist that they do, that means more austerity. And they will then be discredited in addition to everybody else. And so what is their position? What's her position in particular, because she ran against him? And what weight does the vice president have? And what's going on that there hasn't been a revolutionary organization? Maybe it's because of the FARC, because the FARC took away you know, they were supposed to be Marxist too, and they clearly weren't Marxist. And you know, they have this never-ending absurd guerrilla warfare that is disconnected from the working class. So maybe they're responsible for, or in large part responsible for, the lack of revolutionary leadership. But given Colombia and what your description of it, there should be some organization or party built that's going to pull this whole thing out of the morass. And I'm not sure if there is any, or that you just didn't get an opportunity to go into it, because this is a very, very, very long discussion. But you know, those are just some of my thoughts and questions.
Thanks, Carol. Very key questions. Cheryl.
My question really tags on to what Ian was talking about, which is I've been paying attention to the election of Boric, or is it Boric or Boric in Chile, and I listened to his first official speech to the Chilean people, and it was, on the one hand, very much in the tradition of, I would say, Latin American leftists, which are masters of revolutionary sounding rhetoric, but short on actually accomplishing what they promise, as Ted has pointed out with Petro and others. And of course, well, it's not easy to bring about those sort of changes, but I am curious what, but it was an impressive speech. It was a large laundry list of all the things that they were going to do together as a people, and they were never going back. They were going back to the days of Allende, never going back to those kinds of defeats going forward into the future. Everything's going to be great. But so in any case, but what I'm curious about, Ted, is how are, like the people that support Petro, are they hoping for some kind of an alliance with the other elected sort of leftists like Boric? Are people talking about that? Are there possibilities for that? And if, well, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Like I said, my question is really a tag on to what Ian was saying.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, well, look, apologies for connecting a little late because of some internet problems. You know, we in the States are not always up to standard as of Colombia. But, you know, our point in relation to the discussion, which relates a lot to the alliances which are made between different parties and the like. And I never understood this until I read this book here, you know, My Life in the CIA, because this guy, Philip Adjie, spent a lot of his weekends were spent going to the post office, collecting letters which were sent from different parties, rewriting those letters so that where there was an agreement, there was suddenly a nasty word exchanged, resealing those letters and posting them to make sure that there was utmost hostility between parties which were not revolutionary, but sort of in an alliance with parties which were more left. And the CIA spent an enormous amount of time just causing trouble between bourgeois parties, not even revolutionary parties. In other words, they wanted to break up any attempt to form a kind of political coherence in the national bourgeois. And I never really understood this in its full depths until I saw this rather overlong program on Bolivar and Bolivarism, and that the rise of the bourgeois, or the attempt to rise of the bourgeois against Spain particularly, but also against Portugal, but mainly against Spain, involved all kinds of complicated alliances among different leading families, cliques, and so forth, around the issues of national democracy. Let me use that phrase. In other words, were you going to release the slaves from slavery? And were they then going to be allowed to become part of the army and so forth? So you had, in that struggle against Spain, which should have united the nation and should have brought all kinds of major political groups together, you had a general philosophy or a kind of political approach which was anti-imperialist or against Spanish imperialism, but one which was also very opportunist in terms of its internal coherence, in terms of not wanting to free whole layers of oppressed people from the bondage in which they were in, and also very opportunist because they tried to use US imperialism against Spanish imperialism. So there was all kinds of kind of treachery and confusion in the national bourgeois, which has led to this extraordinary fracturing of parties, it seems to me. And then on top of it, I'm just trying to answer or think through some of the points which Ed and Cheryl and Carol have raised about this incoherence, or let's say not incoherence, but lack of a full assembly of a working class consciousness. And it's, you know, it's all to do with the impaired economic development of the country. In other words, you have a very weak capitalist class, which has to be dependent on one form of imperialism or another, and on top of multinationals. For instance, I think that the oil companies are all, multinationals, if I've got them right. In other words, they have to make some deal with the devil, and then it's just what kind of a deal. And the issue then, in my view, so that's the first thing, is the weakness and incoherence of the national bourgeoisie. The second point is the devastating effects of guerrillaism. Now, you see, I think we all have come from traditions in which we've been sharply critical of guerrillaism. And that's been a principled position because we want to highlight the coherence of working class, well, first of all, of Marxism, and secondly, of building a working class organizations and linking that to Marxist ideas, rather than towards putschism or opportunism of all kinds, which could get you in power and maybe change things or maybe not at all. And it seems to me that this legacy, if I could just make a quick reflection in South Africa, many of those who see themselves in the guerrillarist tradition in South Africa are now going out and burning the houses of foreign Black people in South Africa. They see that as part of the revolutionary tradition. In other words, turning a war against apartheid in the past again to a war against poor people. In other words, an aspirant, apparently radical guerrillarist tradition, which is actually militantly petty bourgeois and capitalist. And this links to a point you'd made, which is the small truck owners and so forth. In South Africa, I don't know if it's the same in Colombia. These guys can buy a truck or maybe 2 or 3 trucks. They have to get money from the banks to be able to buy these trucks. They then run it against larger companies and also against the railway and to other forms of transport, because they've got to be ascendant. And as we know in Chile, those elements can be radical for a moment, but then profoundly reactionary, because I think the Allende government was really brought to its knees through strikes by these trucking companies. In South Africa, it's a absolutely rotten tradition. They're trying to smash the railways now, and they're succeeding because they want only all containers, all cargo to be carried by them and not by the railway system. They don't want anything like socialism. They don't want a coherent state sector because they want to rise as the new capitalist class after devastation in the economy. Now, I'm drawing some points, a little too far, but I want to think about this tradition of guerrillarism, which actually has been around zero. In fact, it's a negative. It seems to me that the entire heritage of all these lives, which are particularly of the FARC now, if I understand it correctly, are often being hunted down and killed. I mean, that's what the stories that I hear from various organizations of repute. In other words, they do not have that positive support from the community because it seems they've achieved nothing. And because they've achieved nothing, they're just hanging on to different sections of petty bourgeois parties, which is devastating to think about. So all that huge, if you could think the millions of human hours spent in fruitless guerrilla activity instead of studying Marxism and try to build class organization, it's absolutely fantastic. And then we can understand the morass, in which, the Colombian working people, are at the moment. I just want to raise those questions because I don't, at the moment, I think I share with others, I don't see a way in which the working class can rise to its feet in this very confused political situation. And it's we'd like to see a revolutionary party arise, but maybe the main problem, it seems to me, is clarification of the ideas, understanding what the national bourgeois was capable of doing in terms of being anti-Spanish imperialism, but then the very weakness, subsequent. Just one last point, I see that Colombia exports something like 60% of cocaine, to the States. And I mean, you can see all the Netflix series on the drug lords and all the rest of it. So I do think how do the cartels run things? That's a question I think we also need to ask.
Thank you, David. Very important points. I see. Oh, Ian has his hand up. Yeah. Ian, are you there? Oh, I see he's trying to get admission. So perhaps, Ted, if you'd like to answer some of those points briefly, and perhaps then throw it open for discussion again, and then you sum up at the end. Is that okay?
Sure. Well, that's a lot. And I don't know if I can answer all of your questions adequately. Let's start with the relation of the poor petty bourgeoisie and the working class. I think Carol got it right. This is the working class, as I think this is true all over the world to one extent or another. In the United States, you have guys who fix cars in their garage for money, and then they go to work in a factory. It's the same kind of thing here, only people are poorer. Car ownership isn't so common, although it's becoming common. So people who sell candy on the street at intersections, if they can get a job that pays them a wage, stop selling candy on the street and go get the job. And if they lose a job, they go back and sell candy. There are all kinds of gradations of the relations between these poor, independent business people, from selling candy on a street corner to having a little store in their garage, or to having a little plot of land where they grow some potatoes, but they still have to work for money. And those gradations create one social mass where a class of wage workers is not easily distinguishable from the poor petty bourgeoisie. That situation has not been clarified by the organization of a mass trade union movement, and therefore no labor party. So that kind of social distinction never happened here. The left that did emerge in Colombia grew out of that social mass of people, normally led by people from it who had gone to the public university system. Those people became the electoral leaders, and they became the guerrilleros, the leaders of the guerrilla organizations. The political expression of that mass of poor people that unite the poor petty bourgeoisie and the wage workers has been radicalism rather than socialism. Although most of these people historically have called themselves Marxists. And the Marxist tradition in Latin America is not the same as it is in Europe. You know, the Mariateguists, the followers of this guy in Peru, are very influential. It's sort of like a homegrown version of Maoism. And you talk about miners are usually well organized and militant, thinking of the Mine Workers Union in England or the United Mine Workers in the United States. You can forget that here. There are 150,000 miners officially in Colombia, in a population of 50 million. Those 150,000 miners have 3 unions to represent them. And those unions bore a lot of the brunt of the attack of the paramilitaries, assassinations of their leaders. And really, I mean, nobody knows exactly how many union leaders and activists have been killed in this country in the last 3 decades, but it's more than 10,000. So the repression of the unions in this country has been significant and serious, which is one of the reasons for the very small percentage of workers that are organized. It's not the only reason, but one. The underground mining in this country is mostly done by child labor, by children who work for their parents. It's an extremely backward sector of mining. It accounts for a lot of the coal mining in this country. So the teachers union and the murders of students. Well, first of all, the teachers union has had many, many, many teachers assassinated and union leaders. Of course, the teachers union is very opposed to the paramilitaries and organizes against the paramilitaries. And in the past, the teachers union has had close relations with some of the guerrilla organizations for one reason, to defend the teachers against murders. And the guerrillas did a shitty job. In fact, the guerrillas never adequately defended the mass organizations, which is one reason the FARC did not have popular support. Because when the repression came down against the popular movements in the 1990s, the FARC went to the hills to hide. The union leaders in the towns and cities were the ones who were killed because they didn't go hide. So, guerrillerismo and bolivarianismo are big, big topics. Simón Bolivar wanted to unite all of Latin America, except Portugal, all of Spanish-speaking Latin America, in one, or at least in South America, and he wasn't clear about Central America and Mexico, but he had this dream of the United States of Latin America. And it resulted in the formation of a country called Gran Colombia, which included Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, and Ecuador, the current countries. Gran Colombia was divided through a process of civil wars. Because I didn't want to go into the whole history, but there was no unity of the Latin American bourgeoisie. The Latin American bourgeoisie was interested in controlling the state apparatus for reasons of corruption. And if only one faction gets to control one state apparatus, there's nothing for our little faction in this other city. So each major city formed a country around itself so they could milk the state apparatus. And in Central America, you incredibly, stupidly have 6 countries. But that process occurred in the 19th century. That process has been over for a long time. In the 1980s, the Trotskyists around Nahuel Moreno and the Salvadoran and Nicaraguan revolutions called for the formation of one Central American state and the revival of unity in Latin America, which, as Cheryl mentioned, is a good idea, a great idea. But none of the current crop of leftish leaders is focusing on that, as far as I can tell. Chavez, before the oil crash, and before he died, was trying to get some kind of Latin American unity against imperialism. But he did it basically through giving away petrodollars to Cuba, to Nicaragua, to Argentina, and essentially a form of bribery. And Chavez's oil money diplomacy was doomed to failure because he thought oil prices were going to stay high forever. In the end, he bankrupted Venezuela. Venezuela is in hock to China for its oil production for the next decade. And Maduro is committed to paying China every bolivar. Bolivar is worthless, but the internal economy of Venezuela functions in the black market with dollars more than it does in bolivars. Bolivars are used in the official stores, which, well, now they have a little, the shelves are not as empty as they were at the worst point, but Venezuela is a basket case. Millions and millions of people have left Venezuela. First, the middle class left. The bourgeoisie always lived in Miami and other places, but the middle class left. The poor people are leaving. The oil workers have left. Venezuela is a disaster. And Venezuela is the main political campaign tool of the right all over Latin America. Don't elect the left. we will become a second Venezuela. This is the campaign slogan of the right everywhere. Because everyone in Latin America knows Venezuela is a disaster. The people on the street corners selling candy are mostly Venezuelans. You go to a restaurant, the waiters now, they're Venezuelans. It is amazing how many Venezuelans are here, and the Colombian government, controlled by Duque, has given them the legal right to stay here and the legal right to work. It's much farther to the left than Joseph Biden is in the United States, or the fucking Labor Party for that matter in the United Kingdom. You know, Duque opened the doors to the Venezuelan immigrants. Can you imagine this right-wing paramilitary guy? That's a very complex situation. Bolivarianismo also is very Catholic. And the conservative parties of Latin America are descendants of Bolivar. And the Catholic Church is the most reactionary force in Latin America. And it is the base of the conservative party in Colombia. And it is one of the main organizers of the paramilitaries. So this is such a complicated topic. I'm sorry, I can't. I think it was Ed said, I don't get the whole picture. Well, I don't know anybody who gets the whole picture here. And I don't think Gustavo Petro, the leader of the Pacto Historico, does either. I don't think the Marxist professors at the National University of Colombia do either. I cannot give you all the answers. I wish I could. There is no answer to, I can't see her right now. I think the woman's name was, Carol. In answer to Carol, I don't think there's any revolutionary party in Colombia. I don't think there's one in the United Kingdom either. I don't think there are any revolutionary parties anywhere on the planet at this moment. The left, the planetary left, as it was organized in 1990, crashed and burned. There are a lot of left-wing organizations in Colombia, however, including one Trotskyist organization and a few little tiny groups that say they're Trotskyists. And they're mostly ineffectual, small sectarian groups. In the 1970s, the Morenoist current and the Lambertist current were both large in Colombia, with more than 1,000 militants each. Now, the remnant of the Morenoists has maybe 100 people. They supported Francia Marquez in the primary elections. But they don't know what to do. They are following behind Francia Marquez, who is not a Marxist. I am not going to start a new political party here. I'm not a Colombian. And I don't pretend to lead these movements. I think that I had hopes in the Polo Democrático. My own view is that what we need is a big tent party of socialism, within which is what I think revolutionaries should be for, is what I think Marxists should be for. And it began to form here as the Polo Democrático Alternativo. But it was destroyed. It was destroyed by the ambitions of its leaders, probably by intervention of the CIA, as one person here mentioned, because the United States Embassy does have a big operation here. The CIA has a big operation here. And for a long time, the Colombian embassy was the largest US embassy in the world. It was like a big fortress. But I don't think that their intervention was decisive. I think the left in this country was dominated by the remnants of Stalinism, of the old Communist Party and of the Maoists. And they wanted to make a deal with bourgeois political parties. They made one with a party called ANAPO. ANAPO was a party descended from Rojas Pinilla. It was the legal side of the split which created M19. And the Polo Democratico elected a series of mayors, sort of like Ken Livingstone in London, if you can imagine, a Colombian analog. And those mayors they did some good things. They built more preschools, they built more public schools, they opened soup kitchens, and they fought to build a metro. You have the tube in London. I assume some of you are in London. And there are metros all over the world, but Bogota has 10 million people, no metro, because the former president's family owns the bus system. And finally, they're building a metro because the Polo fought for it. But one of those mayors was from ANAPO, and he stole as much money as he could and discredited the Polo completely, and the Polo exploded. So that attempt to form the big tent party of socialism here failed. And it failed because the leaders of it were essentially people with an organization whose basic theory was in favor of making alliances with bourgeois parties. Petro, Gustavo Petro, is a very smart guy. If you hear him debate, you will be convinced he's right. He isn't always right, but he knows what he's talking about. And he is the only candidate who talks about the real problems of the country: the healthcare system, the pension system, the environmental problems, the issue of the paramilitaries, the corruption of all the political parties. Unionization. There's something called formalization of the economy. That means people work in the formal economy instead of the poor petty bourgeoisie working in the informal economy. Petro speaks about the practical, real, individual issues, and he has answers to them. His opponents don't. They say Petro is scary. Petro will make Colombia like Venezuela. Vote for anybody but Petro. So Petro has gained a lot of traction and might get elected. But Petro himself has the same orientation to alliances with bourgeois parties. And as a practical politician, once he gets elected, if he gets elected, he will try to form alliances in the chamber and in the Senate with the Liberal Party, Cambio Radical, and the Green Party. So this gets back to the question about the IMF. Petro is much more radically against the IMF in words than Francia Marquez. Francia Marquez doesn't even talk about it, as far as I know. Francia Marquez's radicalism is because of her history as a protest leader and a very brave woman who has stood up to the paramilitaries. It's not based on her radical speeches about things like the foreign debt. As far as I've never heard a word from her about that. So how will they deal with the foreign debt? Well, I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do. You know, Petro, when he was mayor of Bogota, improvised everything. Petro had a team of people who were very smart, who included a lot of technocrats who knew all the nuts and bolts, and he destroyed his own team. He's an egotistical, arrogant asshole. He now has a new team, and maybe they will do a better job in terms of being a radical reform leader of Colombia. It's possible. if they renege on the foreign debt, Colombia will be fucked unless they put together some sort of international movement against paying the foreign debt, at which Petro has talked about doing. So you have to put Petro potential for, he's potentially more like going to be just as successful as Syriza has been in Greece. In other words, likely to not to live up to expectations. But I wouldn't say that's guaranteed, because he was elected in the atmosphere of a rising tide of the left in Latin America. So, and I think I have addressed most of the things that people raised in the question session. Argentina had more population than Colombia until recently. Argentina's population has stagnated, Colombia's has grown. But Argentina is the only place in Latin America where there really is some kind of working class, organized trade union movement, and where some sort of Trotskyism is a strong force. Brazil is another, I'm not going to talk about Brazil here. Lula is running for president again. He has good chances of winning, but his running mate is from the right wing of the country. So Lula is another one of these working class leaders with an orientation to alliances with bourgeois political parties. And what can potentially come out of the situation in Colombia? For me, it depends on the young people who were the backbone of the national strikes last year and are the backbone of the voters groups for Petro. They talked last year about organizing a new party, a national strike party, because they didn't trust Petro and the political leaders. They didn't do that. But there is potential for all kinds of developments among those people, mostly influenced by anarchism, partly influenced by guerrillerismo, partly influenced by Trotskyism. But this is a stew that is below the surface. Unless you get invited to a meeting of students from the Teachers University or from the National University, you don't know what these people are thinking. They are meeting in their houses. They are meeting in school classrooms. And there are lots of them. But exactly what's going on, I can't tell you.
Ted, is that it? We finished?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Thanks very much. I mean, we've explored a lot of the issues, and you've thrown a lot of light on the situation. So thank you for that. I'll assume I see there's no comrades have their hands up, so I assume nobody wants to ask any supplementaries. I'd like to thank you very much, Ted, for your contribution and for coming here. Before we finish, I'd like to make one point. Over the last 2 years, WIN has held meetings every week. We've had participants from countries all over the globe, and we've had lead-offs from comrades in, I think, something like 35 countries. So I think it's given us a really good finger on the pulse of the movement as it's developing. And of course, like today, we've had plenty of time and opportunity for comrades to raise their points in discussion. And I think we've all learned a great deal from it. Now, we intend to carry on exactly in the same way. But sometimes we have a little bit of a hiatus in relation to finding the next speaker. And we did.
Roger appears to have cut out. We'll give him a moment or two to come back.
I think we had something.
Oh,
You froze.
Roger, are you back with us now? Unmute yourself, Roger.
Hey, I'm sorry, I don't know, every now and again I lose my connection. It's a bit unstable. I don't know how much you heard of what I said, but I won't go over it again. But I just wanted to say we've had a little bit of a problem for next week. Now, we're still looking for somebody, and we have plenty of opportunities, so I think it'll all be sorted out. But one thing we haven't done, which I want to do today now, is appeal to comrades. If you have any contribution that you would like to make, any reports, any questions you'd like to raise or to have discussed at the meetings, please don't hesitate to volunteer and to say so. So either now, if you actually are eager to do that now, but if not, you all have my email address. You get your notices through the email which comes from me. Please do volunteer or make suggestions, because we're always open to any offers. So anybody want to say anything now?
Thank you for the discussion.
Okay, well, in that case, if nobody has any other announcements or anything they want to say or contribute, thank you very much.
I have an announcement. This is Steve Zeltzer. So,
Hey, Steve.
yeah, Ted, 40 years ago, Ted and I were active in the hotel workers strike in San
Well,
Francisco.
before that, I used to go to Passover dinners with you, Steve.
Yeah, that's right.
Hi, Ted.
Long time. So I wanted to let people know that David and I have been, and others are working on a project to educate and expose the role of the AFL-CIO internationally. As everyone knows, the AFL-CIO has been involved through Irving Brown since the formation of the AFL-CIO and intervening in workers' organizations around the world, and attacking trade unionists and subverting independent workers' organizations. So there's been a book called El Golpe about the role of the AFL-CIO and the CIA in murdering Ford trade unionists in Mexico City. They brought in thugs and murdered a trade unionist. So anyway, we have set up a organizing project, education organizing project, to demand that there be full transparency in the AFL-CIO about their record around the world in different countries, and also to end the $75 million a year, or the $75 million they're getting from the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, which funds the AFL-CIO's international operations through this thing called Solidarity Center. So we are organizing a press conference at the AFL-CIO in April, either the 8th or the 9th, and we're going to be having an educational conference in Washington at the community college there on the role of the AFL-CIO in Korea, Venezuela. It's the 20th anniversary of the attempted coup in Venezuela, also Korea and South Africa, and David is going to be contributing to that as well. So I think it's important that workers in the United States be educated about the role of the AFL-CIO and its relationship with U.S. imperialism, and also that we connect with workers around the world who've been affected radically. I mean, there have been murders of trade unionists around the world, organized and coordinated by the AFL-CIO, working with the CIA. So anyway, I just wanted to make that announcement, and we'll be sending out an announcement when we get the finalized details. But I think it's an important issue that workers need to be aware about.
All right, thank you very much, Steve, and we'll definitely stay in touch about that. I'm sorry, I didn't see you here before. Have you just arrived? Anyway, okay. If there's nothing else, I thank comrades for your attendance, and we'll see you next week, one way or another. Okay.